Welcome to CARICOM Matters. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. Last week's program ended with our guest presenting a picture of what an African-Caribbean free trade agreement could look like. Now, during his initial contribution to the panel discussion, Ambassador Wayne McCook asserted that free trade area agreements are not the only arrangements through which trade can be fostered. He provides details.
In our discussion, we've been talking about the ecosystem as you described it, the different inputs that make life work, and so the different inputs that make trade work. So if you look at the different pieces of that ecosystem, traditional FTAs, or free trade agreements, are based fundamentally on market access. That is, reducing tariffs, establishing rules of origin. So you have to establish that the product is from the place you say it comes from. That's a rule of origin in the agreement. And you have to establish that the tariff you apply is beneficial. And that means that you will give preferential access to the other party to your trade agreement. Now, that is a very complicated thing to do, because when you give up tariffs, it has revenue implications, it has implications for domestic competitiveness. So there is a lot of caution that is exercised in assessing whether to proceed with that typical FTA. Then there are other dimensions to the free trade agreement, including rules for dispute settlement, rules that provide for certain remedies if there are breaches in the trade agreement. When I said there are other approaches, a big buzzword in trade has been trade facilitation. How do you ease the movement of goods from one party to the other? And all CARICOM single market participants, well, all CARICOM member states except for the Bahamas are members of the WTO, so they all subscribe to the same fundamental rules of trade. And one of those is that if you create an exception in certain areas, you have to do so in a manner that is consistent with certain rules. So you can't give someone better than another member unless there's a clear exception that allows you to do it. And one of those is the exception that allows for us to have the single market, which is that if you have a customs union or a single market and you give to each other the same privileges in a sort of a bargain for a bargain among your members, you can have a sort of bubble within the bigger trade environment. So your exception is allowed. But if you're not getting into an agreement that says you're going to treat your other party better than other members and take away a privilege that you have guaranteed them in your overall agreement that's under the WTO, you can enter into arrangements for cooperation. And so what we see a lot of talk about these days in trade is entering into arrangements to facilitate one party to facilitate the other. So you're not going to reduce tariffs. You're not going to limit to specific rules for a product to be given special treatment in relation to tariffs or access. You can then say, enter into agreements about how to promote trade to each other, how to support the financing of trade. So when you look at, for example, the Afrexim Bank proposal to have a facility for the region, it's not a trade agreement. but it's an arrangement that could facilitate trade. So when I mentioned that you can look at ways to support trade without going through a traditional FTA, is to look at the different pieces of the trade puzzle and say, what can I do that will add value? The main complicated issue is giving tariff concessions, which is at the heart of an FTA. And if we can look at other ways of cooperation, it may be even about information sharing, because information in business oftentimes is the source of value. And so we're shortly to launch in the Caribbean region a platform called the SIMSU Pro, Caribbean Integrated Marketplace. And the idea is for producers to list on this marketplace that would be structured under the CARICOM umbrella. And so if you're a producer of beans in Belize, you put that production on this site. And if you're a purchaser of beans who needs beans for integration in some other product, you look at that site and you say, well, I can get it duty-free from Belize because it's within the single market, quality is right, then you purchase it from Belize. You don't have to wait and say, do I need to pay duties to get it from somewhere else, or should I seek to get an exemption of duty in order to get it? So that information sharing would, if effective, reduce transaction costs. Because the time you take to go looking all around the world for supplies that are right next door, if you can know that those are available immediately, that's an advantage. Now, if you look at it in terms of a partner, if you're able to know what it is that is available, cola nut, I gather it's used for a particular drink. What if you had that information directly from source? So what we're trying to do in the region in terms of, we'll see how it works because it requires participation to be successful. But that information that you can leave school, if you're starting your little business, go home and say, I'm going to look on site to see what I can get from my neighborhood. If you're looking to Africa, I can look on site and see what it is that they're going to. So I'm saying if you looked at other forms of building the capacity to trade without necessarily having binding commitment on tariffs and other elements that are critical to an FTA, you could still make progress.
Ambassador McCook continues by recalling some points of interest shared during the session, specifically as it relates to the key principles of a good trading relationship.
I think certainly in our panel, the head of the Nigerian Manufacturers Association made a point about the fundamentals of a good trade relationship, which is it has to be good for business. It has to make sense. I think he mentioned the law of the pocket. That is, businesses trade for value and benefit. And so it is clear that on both sides, the exploring opportunities for trade and economic connections at the level of firms, at the level of countries, would be a realistic one. That is, businesses present would be looking for value. And I think that's important because if you keep that in mind, you will pursue opportunities that make sense and are sustainable. Because we in the region, of course, are right now focused on developing competitive sectors, beginning in agriculture with the 25 by 25 initiative, which is advancing, and the effort now underway to develop a regional industrial policy. Why do I mention these two things? The challenge that the region has faced, both within the internal market, because the point would have been made that, for example, in food imports, the region imports billions of dollars in food. And that is, of course, front and center in the effort to advance the 25 by 25 project to increase agricultural supply within the region. If we are able to address our supply side challenges, improve the competitiveness of firms, that will in turn enhance the region's capacity to build external trade. And this has implications, of course, for what we might or might not be able to do in building trade relations with Africa. Because if we are not competitive, if when you take your product to market, the quality and the price is inferior to those of your competitors, you won't be able to maintain the market on sentiment. You have to maintain it on value. And I think that the focus, and several of the firms in the region, I think, are laser focused on building their competitive strengths. And as more and more of this happens, I think the region will be able to look to the external trade environment in a more offensive and positive way. We are quite defensive at the moment because, and we have challenges of vulnerability, some of them structural, that will make certain opportunities difficult for our industries to grasp. But I would say not impossible. And whether we focus on niches within certain sectors, and in modern trade practice, we have the emergence of value chains, where you don't have to make the whole car. You focus probably on just making steering wheels. And I think we've seen economies and sectors in certain economies built around this proposition that you lock into a value chain and you do something that you are highly competitive at.
Ambassador McCook goes on to detail how the region could advance trade while contemplating a free trade agreement. More specifically, by prioritizing sectors in which there is opportunity for valuable exchange.
The option of looking at sectoral prospects in the relationship with Africa. So you don't try to look at everything at once. You examine one or two areas where there is potential for valuable mutual exchange. And I think that approach of looking for opportunities, whether in segments or in sectors or in even single industries, we have to look at every option that can help us to build and add value to our trade performance. And addressing the supply side, as I mentioned, whether in agriculture or in goods, is critical. You mentioned the orange economy, which of course dominates the economies of the region. Services. And there are services, financial services, though we face particular challenges that require significant advocacy by our leadership, particularly in the ways in which our financial centers are treated by certain international systems. But tourism, of course, is an area in which the region is a significant global player, both in terms of innovation in the tourism product and the natural value of the product based on our geographic and other assets. But I think when we look at the totality of the regional economy, we can see opportunities, and we must build on opportunities where they arise. And services, I think, is an area in which, especially with digitalization, the ability to sell services without leaving your computer room, and the capacities that I think we're seeing across the region, where a push for development of skills in certain sectors. We have, for example, in business process outsourcing, a high growth area in a number of member states. We need to accentuate these positives and build on these opportunities and see our trade prospects in totality, goods and services. Whether we need free trade agreements to improve performance is an assessment that we have to make case by case. But I think it is very clear that we need to use trade policy to support business. We need to see trade agreements as facilitators of growth for business. And that, I think, is you mentioned earlier, the importance of South-South cooperation, non-traditional engagement. We need to look where the opportunities are. Look, as some would say, through the windshield, not the rear view mirror. Although, of course, you need to know what's behind you.
Considering all that we have discussed, Ambassador McCook provides his perspective on the process, the intricacies and complexities that would be involved in achieving a Caribbean-African Free Trade Area agreement.
One of the things that the Council of Trade and Economic Development, which is the council that drives regional trade policy, it has insisted that in looking at future trade engagement, we make a careful assessment of the prospects for success and the implications of those agreements for member states and the region as a whole. So the first thing would be we'd have to assess, and I did mention Commissioner Mochanga's promise to undertake a study on that side. Similarly, we would be obliged to we'd have to do a similar assessment. What would be the prospect for an FTA? What kind of products would we be capable of exporting to a current and future African market as we assess it? What would be the means by which those products would get from supplier to the demander? Is there a critical mass of interest? That is, are there enough firms, enough member states who would see value in preferential trade access to Africa and be prepared to grant the access to the single market and the national markets that would be required to make an FTA work? And those assessments would have to make sense for both sides. So I think the first, as I said, in process to do those assessments. You'd also have to figure out in relative terms, where would you want to build your expanded trade agreements or arrangements first? Right now, our focus has been in the region. So I mentioned the agreement with Costa Rica, the agreement with Colombia that we're actually right now in the process of updating. So we're in active negotiations with Colombia as we speak. So you'd have to look at what's the sequence. Even if you found that there was feasibility is it feasibility right now or feasibility down the road? And whatever the assessment, is it more advantageous to move in that direction right now, that is to an African negotiation with Africa, or to continue to negotiate with the region, continue to work on the strong traditional agreements that you have, certainly the European Economic Partnership Agreement, which is, as I said, the most comprehensive agreement that we have. So one would, I think, in terms of the way forward, you'd be taking all of this, looking at it with careful analysis, so that if you were to recommend that, if an institution like our Secretariat or a member state even would recommend that we proceed to look at an FTA, have you answered the key questions? Do we have the competitive strengths to meaningfully supply into the African market to create value for our own industries? Would we be at any risk if we opened access, that a risk that would be prejudicial to our own businesses? That's sort of the standard assessment you make when you look at any prospective agreement. And you'd have to do that kind of assessment in respect of the potential for an African FTA. If we answer the questions positively, that is, there is an assessed value proposition in building a trader relationship with Africa. There are opportunities to sell rum, to sell craft items, an opportunity to sell nutraceuticals, an opportunity to sell cosmetics. The fundamentals that you would have to look at in any trade relationship would need to be assessed for an FTA with Africa. The other aspects that I mentioned earlier, that is, if you're not going the route of an FTA, I think are easier to contemplate.
Well, as you've heard, there is a number of options to contemplate as the region seeks to embrace greater trade relations with the African continent. Until next time, I'm Miles Eversley. Do take care and thanks for your time.